Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, President of Connecticut Audubon Society, and welcome to this evening's community program. As always, I want to have a land recognition statement. Mononkatuk wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tucket, Nunkatuk, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of Native and Indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. We have two more programs coming up in March. Next Wednesday, our friend Pat Lynch will return with some tips on simple, inexpensive changes to make a fairly ordinary suburban yard into a friendly habitat for wildlife of all kinds. And then on Wednesday, March 30th, former Connecticut Deep Commissioner, Dr. Robert Klee, who's now teaching at the Yale School of Environment and the Yale Law School, will give us his perspective of the local effects of climate change and present a case for state and local climate policy and collective next steps. You can register for these programs on our website. Before we get started, please remember to keep yourself muted during the program. If you have questions, enter them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Or at the end, you can also raise your hand in the reactions button and I'll have you unmute yourself to ask your question. Dr. Brooke Bateman is Director of Climate Science at Audubon. She leads Audubon's research-based climate initiative linking climate change and bird conservation. She and her team developed Survival by Degrees, 389 bird species on the brink, and is Director of Climatewatch, where she works with volunteers to understand how climate change currently affects birds in North America. We welcome Brooke, and she's going to tell us about natural climate solutions. Brooke.
Thanks, Dennis. Let me share my screen. Nice to be here tonight. Start my presentation. Great. Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. So today I'm going to talk about birds and climate change and how natural climate solutions can pave the way on climate action, and how we can sort of use it to bridge the gap between the biodiversity and the climate crises. So we are in the midst of a climate crisis. The temperatures over the Earth's continents and oceans have risen about 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages, which means we're already the majority of the way to the 1.5 degree warming goal that was set by the Paris Agreement. And of the hottest 17 years, 16 have now occurred since 2000. So clearly things are changing in terms of the climate. And I just really wanted to highlight that it's an unprecedented rate of climate change. As the Earth has moved out of ice ages over the past millions of years, the global temperatures have risen a total of about 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, but that's taken about 5,000 years. In the past century alone, it's been a rate of 10 times faster than that. And in the future predictions, we're looking at 2 degrees to 6 degrees Celsius in the next century alone, which is up to 20 times the rate. So this is really an unusual amount of climate change in terms of its pace and its magnitude in a short amount of time. I also want to highlight that we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. 1 in 4 birds have disappeared since 1970. That's nearly 3 billion fewer birds since 1970 that we have in North America. So like looking at this, a lot of this is tied to habitat change and change in the anthropogenic change of our landscapes. And I want to kind of highlight what that looks like. This is looking at housing density from the 1940s So here, areas in yellow or red are more people, more housing density. You can see here green areas are more green and natural spaces. But if we cycle through the different projections for the different time periods, we can see a dramatic alteration of the habitat in that time period and in just a short amount of time up until 2010. And then projections for 2030, we're even seeing more dramatic loss across the country. So in the past, people have talked about how birds have responded, they have had to respond to climate change in the past. But in the past, they would be navigating an ecosystem that was more intact, more pristine. They would be finding intact forests and native grasslands. And they would be able to sort of navigate these shifts that they would have to do in their ranges with climate change in a natural system. Whereas today, they're having to cope with this unprecedented rate of climate change, having to shift their ranges to kind of stay within the climate conditions that they're used to, but might not necessarily be able to find the habitats that are appropriate because things have been dramatically changed by people, whether it be agriculture or housing development. So it's just a different kind of story now for climate change and biodiversity in the current climate situation that we're in. And because of this, it's really become apparent that we cannot keep the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis as two separate things. We really need to look at a way to deal with them together because they are intertwined. And it's something that we're going to have to deal with both of them if we're going to tackle either of them. At Audubon, we like to say that birds tell us that they're the messengers about changes in our environment and climate change. And they are because they're so intimately tied to the world around them. So we can see by looking at birds that the world around us is changing. And I just sort of want to go through a couple of examples that highlight how birds are telling us that climate change is already happening and has been happening for a while. It's not just changes in temperatures of so I think that like when you think about 1.1 degrees warming globally, that's hard to translate to what it means to you locally. And I think birds are a great way to sort of to address that and to see the lens of climate change in your own backyard. So one of the first things we see is that egg laying dates are changing. We're seeing across the board, birds are laying their eggs earlier. One large-scale study showed that birds are laying their eggs up to nearly 7 days earlier per decade, and North American tree swallows are nesting up to 9 days earlier than they did 30 years ago, and that's corresponding to an increase in average spring temperatures. Bald eagles, particularly in the Midwest, are nesting up to 6 weeks earlier. That's a huge difference, and that's because of the reduced duration in the ice cover of the Great Lakes and rivers in the northern Midwest. Warmer winters and climate change have led to earlier access to these areas for foraging, and the bald eagles are kind of capitalizing on that by nesting earlier. We're also seeing a really interesting change in body size in birds. A couple of different studies have actually found that North American migratory birds have been shrinking through the decades. They're getting smaller in their body size and their wings are getting longer. And the hypothesis for this is that in lower latitudes, closer to the equator, smaller body size helps you deal with heat dissipation and dealing with warmer temperatures. Whereas in colder climates, you want to be bigger to be able to deal with colder situations. And so as the climate is warming, birds are getting smaller to cope with these changes in temperatures. And a more recent study actually found that birds with larger brains are not getting smaller at the same rate. They're actually staying bigger because they're able to sort of use their brains to find ways to adapt to the microclimates within their ecosystem. So it's a little bit unequal in the way that birds are responding. Across the board, birds are migrating earlier in spring. We're particularly seeing this in spring. And a broad scale study that looked at actually radar ecology, which is looking at the signal of birds taking off at night for migration from Doppler radars that we usually think of as for weather radars. You can actually get a signal of birds from this. But looking across multiple time periods, we found that across hundreds of bird species, birds are migrating earlier, up to 2 days a decade. And here's just an example of showing how a bird's used to, for the oriole, arrive on May 6th, and then the leaf out would be after that, flowers would be after that. But now it's sort of asynchronous, it's mismatched, so that the leaf out is happening before the birds arrive, and it's just different timing, everything's shifted earlier. This is causing problems where birds in their environment are becoming mismatched. A mismatch occurs when birds cannot shift their behavior, such as breeding times, enough to coincide with changes in the environment. And long distance migrants are particularly at risk of a mismatch, as it's harder for them to know when the conditions might be ideal in their breeding grounds if they're coming from South America. For example, wood warblers in North America are migrating early enough from their neotropical wintering grounds, despite the fact that spring is getting earlier. And the risk of this is that the spring food sources on the breeding grounds are not timed the right way. So the birds are arriving at a certain time, but the shift in when the plants are coming out and when the insects are coming out, because they're related, is shifted earlier. But if they're still arriving and laying their eggs at the right time, they used to peak, the insects used to peak at the same time of their nestlings, but if that's not happening anymore and the peak of the insects comes before the nestlings, that's going to affect reproductive success. And so we're seeing these mismatches with birds in their environment. Ecological communities are actually getting completely disrupted. This photo on the right is actually a picture of thousands of common murres that washed up dead on the beaches of the Gulf of Alaska. And there have been several of these mass die-offs of seabirds in the region since 2016. They used to happen only every once in a while, and now they're happening more often. And the reason that this is happening is that we're having increased marine heat waves. They kind of call them marine blobs, these areas of really warm temperature in the oceans. They're increasing dramatically, and the warmer temperatures are changing the fish which they rely on for their food resources, is changing which fish occur where, and also affecting where in the water table the fish are. So some of the fish are diving really deep to escape these warm temperatures, and the birds are not able to dive down deep enough to get their food resources. So these birds are starving to death because of these marine heat waves. And we're also seeing changes in distribution. So historically, when we look at paleoclimate, the most common response we saw with species is to shift their ranges. And the reason they shift their ranges is because they want to stay within those climate conditions that they evolved to be within. And so they want to move to areas that are in that right temperature and precipitation sweet spot for them. And we're already seeing this in North America. And so two examples on the top are Carolina wren and the chipping sparrow. These are those smaller bodied southern species. So they are smaller bodied, they're more adapted to heat, but they're actually expanding their winter ranges based on feeder watch data. We can see that they've expanded their winter ranges further north as winters have become more mild. And so these guys are overwintering in areas like Long Island and Connecticut, where we live now consistently, where in the past they didn't. I know my dad has been feeding his birds for 40 years at his feeder, and over the last several decades, he's noticed more and more Carolina wrens. So it's just an example of how you in your backyard can see climate change in action. We're also seeing expansions of the ranges of the hooded warbler to climate change, and contractions of the range, like species like the rusty blackbird that has disappeared from the southern part of its range because of climate change. And across the board, this is looking at Christmas bird count data. If anybody's involved in Christmas bird counts, thank you, because we really use that data to understand how birds are responding to things like climate change and land use change. And many widespread species across North America are decreasing in the southern part of the US and increasing in the north, indicating range shifts due to climate change, because temperatures are warmer, getting warmer in the south, and they're kind of moving north and expanding into these milder areas. So the reason why I wanted to talk about all that is because I wanted to highlight that climate change is already happening. But as I said, we're in the midst of a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And we have these declines in birds. We've lost 3 billion birds. Global warming is considered a threat multiplier. So for these species that are already having to cope with large amounts of change in their landscape and their habitats, and anticipate current amounts of climate change plus the future that's projected, we can just kind of look into the future to understand what might potentially happen with birds moving forward. So there are different kind of climate change scenarios that you can think of from a policy perspective that are related to some of the reports like the IPCC puts out, or agreements like the Paris Agreement, of the different like global temperatures that we can consider. And so there is a scientific consensus that we need to limit the global temperatures, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius globally, but to 2 might be a little bit more realistic. And I do want to say that these are global scenarios. When it actually translates to temperature changes locally in the US, it's actually much higher. So it's a higher amount of warming in the US for the most part. So as I said earlier, we're closer to that 1 degree Celsius. The Paris Agreement goal is that 1.5, and 2 degrees. After 2 degrees, we really consider that a crucial tipping point, which is like a critical threshold, which beyond would yield really dramatic and detrimental and irreversible system level changes in our planet. And that's a consequence of crossing this threshold, is potentially losing billions more birds. So we don't want to go past 2 degrees, but when we look at the pledges that different countries have put out for within the Paris Agreement. So a pledge from the Paris Agreement means that particular country has pledged this amount and these actions. When we look at the pledges that countries have taken, we're looking at more like 3 degrees Celsius. And if we look at the current policies that are in place, not just the pledges, but what people are actually doing in different countries, we're even warmer than that. So we're not where we need to be in terms of climate mitigation. But these are the different scenarios that we took on board when we were looking at our Survived by Degrees report, which looked at how birds in North America were going to be affected by climate change. And so for what we did with this is we looked at the occurrence of birds like the wood thrush, we looked at where they occurred, and we related that to different environmental information, and looked at how climate and vegetation and other factors might change in the future under those different climate change scenarios. And so for the wood thrush, we can see at a 1.5 degree scenario, there's a small amount of red, which is range loss. These are areas that with climate change are going to become no longer suitable. And so at 1.5 degrees, it does have some potential range loss, but it's not considered vulnerable to climate change. But at a 3 degree scenario, this species is considered highly vulnerable to climate change, with more than half of its range being potentially lost due to changes in temperature, precipitation, and vegetation. So when we look across all 605 species that we were able to assess for this, we found that 2/3 of those species were at risk of large amounts of range loss and potential extinction from climate change. And that's if we do nothing, if we let things go the track that we're going currently. Species like these are some of our priority species at Audubon that are both vulnerable to climate change and are currently on the Partners in Flight watch list. This is just a small sample so that we can see the ones that have already suffered biodiversity loss and population declines that could have that threat multiplier of climate change really kind of be a double whammy for them, including species that we love in the Northeast, like the piping plover, the salt marsh sparrow, and the wood thrush. So how will climate change affect birds in Connecticut? Forest birds like the ovenbird may no longer find suitable conditions under no mitigation, meaning taking no action on climate change future. And so if we look across forest birds in general, they're particularly at risk. And so this is a figure that shows on the right is the number of species that are climate vulnerable in red and orange. And on the left are species that are not considered vulnerable. But if you look at the boreal, the western forest, the subtropical, and the eastern forest, these are all species that have more than 50% of that group vulnerable to climate change. With 65% of species in forests are considered vulnerable to climate change. And the birds of the eastern forest have already seen a loss of quite an amount, 170 million birds, or 17% since 1970. We can see sort of how climate change paired together can be really problematic. And this is just what the projections for the ovenbird look like under the different climate scenarios in summer. And you can see that Connecticut becomes unsuitable from between the 2 and the 3 degree, that tipping point. And again, just highlighting that the birds of our eastern forests have already seen dramatic losses moving forward with climate change ahead, causing more problems. I also want to highlight that coastal birds are also vulnerable to climate change. And I know living in Connecticut, you have a broad coastline. Over 50% of coastal species are at risk to range loss. So this is losing parts of their range due to the climate and vegetation factors and changes. This is a species that's dear to my heart that we get at the beach just down the road from me, the piping plover, which I know is an important species across Connecticut as well. Under a 3-degree scenario, this species could be completely no longer occur in summer in Connecticut. And that's up to 87% of its full range lost. For a species that's already endangered, that's pretty dramatic. There is good news though. So we looked at those different scenarios, and if we can stabilize climate change and keep it at that 1.5 degree, then 76% of the species are better off. That means they have less range loss, and they will potentially drop down to being no longer vulnerable. Will drop down a category. And just to highlight, for the piping plover, this is what it looks like in a 1.5 degree scenario. There are parts of Connecticut that will still be potentially unsuitable, but you can see that there's actually quite a bit of areas in eastern Connecticut that are slightly improving, and if not potentially being newly suitable for the species. So there is still hope for piping plover in Connecticut if we can stabilize things. So that was just looking at range loss and how species might have to shift their ranges to keep up with the changing climate. But I also want to highlight that even for species that might be able to stay in one place, there are other threats related to climate change beyond just changes in general precipitation and temperature, including these extreme events and other climate related threats. And so when we think about any individual one of these, if you think about sea level rise, or if you think about extreme heat or droughts, that can be really detrimental to a population, but we might be seeing multiple of these at once across the board. And so when we look across the US at those two different scenarios, we can see that some places will see up to 6 of these threats in the same location. Maybe not at the same exact time, but it could be potentially that they'd be affected by multiple threats. And this is what it looks like for Connecticut. And some of the biggest threats facing Connecticut that are related to climate change are urbanization, sea level rise, spring heat waves, and heavy rain. And we're projected to have a lot more heavy rainfall events in the Northeast, more sea level rise, storms. So that all leads to flooding issues. And then urbanization is related to climate change because as the climate warms, more people are abandoning rural areas and moving into urban areas, and those areas create urban sprawl. And for coastal systems, the urbanization and the sea level rise and the flooding can be problematic because it sort of squeezed that coastal habitat from inland and from the coasts, reducing the amount of habitat that are available for our coastal birds. And so when we look across this, as I kind of highlighted in that picture, if we can stabilize things at 1.5 degrees, there'll be a lot less threats for bird species moving forward. But some of our species are going to be facing up to 4 of these threats together, and a lot of them are in our coastal group because of that issue I was talking about with sea level rise and urbanization and heat waves and floods, and that includes some of these species here, including salt marsh sparrow and piping plover. So I wanted to highlight salt marsh sparrow because I know it's an important species for Connecticut. This one is kind of going to get the whammy, the quadruple whammy of heat waves, heavy rainfall events, urbanization, and sea level rise on top of any amount of range shifts that it might need to do. So putting that all together, we understand that every bird species is going to experience some impact from climate change, meaning even the birds in your backyard and that you love in Connecticut. And that sort of leads us to understand that we need to do 2 different things. We need to protect the places that birds need now and in the future. And so that is what we're calling climate adaptation. That's allowing and building resilience into the system for the inevitable amount of climate change that we know that we're going to see. But we also need to take action at the state and federal level to address the root cause of climate change, which is climate mitigation. So that's reducing our greenhouse gas footprint. And again, we need to link these 2 together and find a way that we can tackle the biodiversity and climate crises together. So Switching gears to talking about a solution and what we can do that does bridge that gap is natural climate solutions. They provide a path forward for both that climate adaptation, that resilience piece, and the climate mitigation, which is sort of a win-win solution. And so I want to talk a little bit more about these and how we can harness them to help for birds. So first, why carbon? Carbon dioxide, and so natural climate solutions work mostly with carbon, but carbon dioxide doesn't have the biggest impact in terms of its ability to trap carbon compared to some of the other greenhouse gases. Methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases have a higher potential to warm, but carbon dioxide makes up 76% of the greenhouse gas totals, and they stay in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. And so they're really important to tackle for the reasons that they're just going to be around for a really long time. In order to get where we need to go, we need to, by 2030, need to be emitting 45% of what was emitted in 2010 and get that to zero in 2050. So that's what we need to do. I want to highlight that the climate policy in Connecticut, we're pretty good with the greenhouse gas emissions targets by 2030, but we're not quite there for the 2050. So we need to do a little bit more to stabilize the climate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And natural climate solutions do provide a great sort of opportunity to pair with emissions reduction. So we need to cut back on what emissions we're putting out there, but nature-based pathways or natural climate solutions are sort of interchangeable, provide a pathway to that. And the way we sort of break up natural climate solutions is to think of it this way. We have 3 different buckets. We have the protect, manage, and restore. So we need to protect areas that are currently storing a lot of carbon or are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere at a good rate every year. And so that's protecting our forests and our wetlands. We need to manage our systems better, including our forests, in a way that is sustainable for birds, but also harnesses carbon. And we need to restore, especially our forests and our wetlands that have been degraded. So natural climate solutions can be effective. They're available and they're proven now, and they can provide roughly 1/3 of the climate action we need by 2030. And just as I had said before, we need fossil fuel mitigation. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that are going out there, but natural climate solutions are a pathway that we need to incorporate. We cannot limit the rise of global warming below 2 degrees and achieve that net zero emissions without major investments in natural climate solutions. So it's a big part of the equation. I just wanted to highlight this really quickly, that we have a lot of potential across ecosystems in the US. This is not adjusted for area. This is just totals. Forests do have the highest potential for climate mitigation, which is how much carbon it can sort of store and pull out of the air every year. When we do look at per unit area though, so like per acre, wetlands actually store one of the biggest capacity per acre to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So they're also important. So switching to what Audubon is thinking about is, we know that natural climate solutions can help birds, biodiversity, and can help climate change, but we need to identify where we can either maintain areas through protection and management, or restore areas that can benefit both biodiversity and climate change. And so that's what we looked at in our natural climate solutions report. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there and what it kind of looks like. But we have 2 different sort of ways that we have prioritized areas in our report, which we can provide the link for you to take a look at. So prior areas to maintain, these are areas that I'm going to dig into what each of these means. So they're important for birds. They're called climate strongholds, but they also have high carbon storage now. So they're currently storing a lot of carbon in their ecosystem, and they're an active carbon sink. And what that means is that they're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere at a good rate. And I'm going to dig into each of these a little bit more so you can understand. But we want to maintain these areas because they're functioning really well for birds and carbon. So a climate stronghold is an area that is predicted to have high climate suitability and hasn't been as modified by humans. So high climate suitability for birds currently, and also under climate change scenarios. So these are areas that for many bird species, so if we're looking at the forest ecosystem, we're looking at like 250 forest birds. These are areas that are important now and into the future, and are a little bit more pristine habitats. And the way we got at that was taking those projections that I talked about earlier for a species like the wood thrush, plus 250 other species in that system, looked at where the areas are going to sort of stay in this yellow and orange and green, they're going to remain stable. And then looking across that, trying to find the areas most important for all of them. And this is how we define a climate stronghold. This is what for one ecosystem, our forest ecosystem, what the climate strongholds look like across the US. And so areas in dark green are really these areas that we're seeing as like really important for birds and carbon. Oh, this is just birds, for birds in now and into the future. And the light green are also important. We call those our supporting strongholds. So we take this information about our climate strongholds and we pair it with information about carbon storage and carbon sinks. And so just to sort of dig into that a little bit, because I know they're kind of like jargony words, but forests are a great example of where we can store carbon. So a lot of the carbon is stored in the living biomass and the growing tissue, the leaves, the growing parts of the trees. But we also have some stored in the dead wood and the litter, and a large amount in the soil organic matter. And so carbon stocks are areas like where the forest or that ecosystem is currently holding a lot of carbon. And the reason we want to hold on to carbon is because if we released it, if we cut down those forests and released it into the atmosphere, because it stays in the atmosphere for 1,000+ years, we wouldn't be able to get that carbon back out of the system in a way that was easy enough for us to do anything important around climate change. So we need to keep the carbon in the system. But we also want to find areas that are actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So we want to keep the carbon stored, but sometimes as a forest grows, it doesn't pull as much carbon because it's not growing as much. And so what we're looking for are areas that are actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it into their biomass through time. And so pulling more carbon in than they emit. So these are areas that we're calling priority areas to maintain for carbon. And when we put it together, we can see where we across the country, we have areas that are of high value for carbon, high value for birds, and then in the dark green, where they overlap. And so we really want to maintain these areas because they're going to function as really important for birds and in now and into the future, and for carbon. And so they're really important for us to maintain them through protection and management. Now, the other side of the coin is that we have a lot of areas that have been disturbed or degraded, but they're still important because they could really add a really key component to this whole equation. And so our priority areas to restore look at areas that have high disturbance, but in the future could be restored to help provide better habitat for birds and for carbon. And so we looked at areas that could be important for birds with carbon, but they've been highly modified by humans, or the forest integrity has been compromised by changes in the ecosystem. So we paired these areas that we consider vulnerable climate strongholds with priority areas that we say they could potentially store more carbon, and they could potentially pull more carbon out of the atmosphere if we reduce disturbance or if we restored these areas. And so if you clear a degraded forest, as I said before, carbon dioxide gets released into the atmosphere. But if you replant there, young regrowing forests and restored habitats actually can pull quite a bit of carbon out of the atmosphere. It takes a while for them to have a high carbon store, but every year they're pulling lots of carbon. So it's really important to restore these areas. And again, we overlay these areas to understand, okay, where are the areas where we could do restoration efforts that would benefit birds and improve our carbon, which would help with climate change. So we didn't just do this for forests. I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones that we did. If you want to find out more about any of them, you can check out the report. But we looked at forests, we looked at grasslands, we looked at wetlands, both interior and coastal, and we looked at cities and suburban systems as well. And what we found is that areas that were critical for birds were also important for carbon. And I think that currently these areas store over 100 billion tons of carbon, but they could pull up to twice as much carbon per year if we put more management and restoration efforts into them, which would get us up to 23% of those goals that we wanted to reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and get to a net zero future. So I think it's important lot of these are, well, the majority of them are on private lands. So we do need to think about ways that we can partner with private landowners to incentivize this type of work. And I also want to identify that we're also looking into the factor that these areas also have people in them. And so we need to take social considerations about which communities these areas are in, how we can use this information to contribute to something like 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of the lands by 2030, but also understanding that there are communities. And so here we've sort of broken up our map into bird and carbon areas that have either vulnerable communities or have social justice considerations, meaning people have their livelihoods invested in the landscape. So thinking about the way that we can prioritize these efforts, but also keeping in mind the people component. And I just want to say that, like, I've been talking a lot about climate mitigation, but these solutions also provide a lot of resiliency and adaptation for birds and for people. And so, for example, forests can reduce the risk of super fires. Restoring wetlands can absorb and filter floodwaters. We can look about restoring watercourses to expand green spaces, to reduce flood risk. Restoring coastal wetlands does help with erosion. And so really we can think about ways that these natural solutions will help climate change, but also help with resilience and adaptation to climate change. Switching to Connecticut, Connecticut has a wonderful opportunity. 85% of Connecticut is within our key ecosystems. That's 3 million acres of priority areas to maintain in the green or to restore in yellow. These areas currently store 500 million tons of carbon and sequester over 1 million tons of carbon per year on average. So really, Connecticut has a lot of opportunity. These are just two examples of forest blocks in Connecticut that are already doing a great job. The Lime Forest Block and the Macedonia Forest Block, mostly entirely in our areas to maintain. There are a couple of edge areas that we could restore, because generally around the edges of intact systems is where you get some disturbance. But these areas are really important for birds under climate change and are doing a good job with carbon currently. These are just some examples of different things, natural climate solutions we can do in forest systems. We can protect forests, we can avoid forest conversion. We can do natural forest management, like ending logging in old growth forests or mature forests, different practices that managers within those systems can do. We can plant native trees and reforest areas and manage wildfire appropriate for that given location. And as I said, 65% of forest birds in Connecticut are vulnerable to climate change. Reforestation will provide early successional forests for birds like the American woodcock and the wood thrush that are vulnerable to climate change. And protection of mature forests, this was taken from a different slide, but mature forests will benefit species like black-throated blue warbler. Many of the Connecticut wetlands are priority areas to restore. These areas there are obviously a lot of coastal urbanization and development in Connecticut, but there is a lot of opportunity to restore these areas to improve the habitat for birds and for climate change. And yeah, restoring coastal wetlands, avoiding coastal wetland conversion, reducing anthropogenic nutrient inputs, and providing things like living shorelines are all great ways to sort of address these issues. And coastal wetlands store the most carbon per acre and can draw down 2.5 times more carbon per year with restoration efforts. So again, there's a lot of opportunity to restore wetlands, in particular the coastal wetlands, that will improve the habitat for coastal bird species like the salt marsh sparrow. And that will also build resilience against things like sea level rise. So I think it's really important to consider the other components that these are going to benefit beyond just the carbon component. And then I do want to highlight that urban and suburban natural solutions do exist. There's a lot of opportunity to do things in your own neighborhood. Urban green spaces, natural infrastructure, blue infrastructure, native plant gardens, and composting are all great opportunities. I think that it also speaks to your own backyard and creating a bird-friendly backyard. and going native. I think that native plants are a great way to benefit birds and pollinators, but they also tend to be more resilient to climate change. They're more drought tolerant. They have large, extensive root systems and can store quite a bit of carbon, and they help with flooding and other issues. And so I think that they're sort of a wonderful solution that people can do in their own backyard around climate change. And then I want to highlight that Connecticut State of the Birds from the Connecticut Audubon Society. I worked with them to write a story for their State of the Birds, but they have provided some recommendations for the state of Connecticut that also includes state-led wildlife conservation efforts and funds to help protect the priority climate stronghold areas. So they're suggesting that these areas we should prioritize and increase land protection in Connecticut to reach the goal of 21% of the land in Connecticut by 2023, focusing on these climate strongholds and priority areas to maintain and restore. And so looking forward, Connecticut, like I said, can play a big role in these sort of win-win solutions of natural climate solutions to help the biodiversity and climate crises. I'm not going to dig into this, but I just wanted to share that it was available. Sometimes when people hear talks about climate change, they're not sure exactly where to go. And Audubon has this climate action guide that I can share the link for that really gives you the different sort of steps you can take as a personal advocate on climate change, including talking more about climate change. I think one of the things that we don't do is talk about it in our daily lives. And so starting the conversation and trying to figure out what your climate story is. And for me, talking about changes I see in backyard birds and how that resonates with my sense of place and what I care about is the way that I can talk about climate change. So finding that way to start the conversation, anywhere to leading your community and doing things around your community, to rebuilding the machinery in your state or your area and joining a national cause. So there's lots of great articles if you're interested in finding out more. And then the last thing that I'll suggest is that we have a program called Climatewatch, which is a citizen or community science program that is actually tracking how birds respond to climate change. And so we have our models that I show the potential range shifts of species like the wood thrush. What we do is we go out twice a year and collect data to find out, are these birds actually shifting the way that our models anticipate that they will be? And we're looking just at the 2020s models predictions. So the near-term climate change, how are these birds responding? And we've already had a scientific paper come out from the data we collected over the first several years. And in fact, we are seeing that the birds are shifting the way that our models are showing that they should. So birds are shifting their ranges based on climate change. And we're really validating the fact that birds are responding to climate change. And it gives a little bit more confidence in these future projections of what could potentially happen if we don't do anything. So if you haven't taken a look at that, I can share that website, but I would really encourage folks to get involved because as a scientist that studies climate change, the way that we sort of have developed survival by degrees, and now that we're understanding things with Climatewatch is through community and citizen science volunteers. And we wouldn't be able to understand how birds are responding to climate change without people going out there and collecting the data. So it's really a great way to get involved and to contribute to climate change if you are a birder. And that's the end of my presentation. I just sort of want to end with that. The bottom line is that what's good for birds is also good for stabilizing climate. And that it's really important that we think about these two crises together and that things like natural climate solutions are a way for people to get involved locally in your backyard, in your community, in your state that can help address climate change and make a better world for birds and for people. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brooke. Is there anyone that has questions? I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask.
My question, Brooke, would be if do younger forests absorb carbon dioxide faster than older forests?
Yeah, so the younger forests do absorb quite a bit of carbon. So I would say yes, as long as they're growing actively. But older forests, more mature forests do still pull a lot of carbon because like larger trees that are growing will pull a lot of carbon. So it's probably one of those things you'd have to look at in like an actual stand, like a forest stand and assess it. But I will say that some forests, once they sort of stop growing, they can emit more carbon than they pull in, but they still have so much carbon storage in their system that we need to keep it. So so yes, but it would depend on the particular forest like situation.
So in reforestation, would that help improve the the amount of carbon that's being taken out of the air by younger growing trees?
Yeah, and so it's one of those things that there's like a balance between the carbon and what's good for birds. And so we clearly want to reforest areas that have been lost or degraded. And so I think that's a really important thing to do, but being mindful about how we do it, doing it with native plants, not planting it in a monoculture, and taking on board what bird species live in those areas. And that's where like local forest managers, including some of the folks that work on the Healthy Forest team here at Audubon, like know exactly how we can do management within local systems. But yes, reforestation is going to be a huge part of the solution and one of the most promising for sure, as long as we're doing it in the appropriate places and manner.
My third question is, with sea level rise and moving into areas that are now mature forests, can should those trees be cut down, and other species of trees which are able to handle the increased salinity that percolates into the soil, getting them to grow in that area where they are on the perimeter of where the marsh migrates into?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I know like the saltwater inundation can create what they call ghost forests, where we have dead trees that are emitting carbon. So I think it's a great suggestion to plant trees that could survive in those locations. Again, it really would have to be like a local manager that would best inform which species and how to go about it and the timing of it. But I do think it's smart to be proactive. And there's a framework that people think about with climate change and conservation in general, instead of trying to conserve things for exactly what they were, trying to move forward to adapt to the system that it's going to be. And it's a resist, adapt framework. And so that would be sort of like adapting to what is inevitable. So, I mean, you can do some sort of mitigation to help prevent some of the changes in the marsh migration, but you're not going to be able to stop all of it. So being able to know what that system could turn into and putting the appropriate plants in that system is one way to do it. And it's interesting because like you are managing and sort of directing the future of that habitat, but if you can do it in a way that is beneficial to biodiversity, then that could be one strategic way to deal with it.
We have an area in the upper ranges of the eastern marsh area that we're doing our research that is going to be the largest area that the marsh is going to move into, and that's the area that I just described, which is now all hardwoods.
Wow, yeah. I'd be interested to hear more about your research and what you guys might be proposing for that area. That's an interesting question.
That thought just came to mind, so I've got to connect with the Yale School of Forestry.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I am a climate scientist. I'm not a forestry person, so they will have much better answers for you in terms of the best way to manage the individual systems.
Yep. Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question about the relationship between the oceans warming and the land warming. I notice a lot of these presentations talk about, 2 degrees here, 3 degrees there, but it's kind of, I guess the question is, it seems to me that it would be a lot more related to the warming of the oceans, and that warming parameter should be different or could be different. Is there any kind of study that's coordinating the whole planet versus just the
Yeah,
land?
so when we did our analyses, we started with just the land assessment. We're hoping to do a seabird assessment too, but the systems are so different in terms of what environmental information to include. So we hope to have an analysis of like survival by degrees for seabirds in the future, and then looking at blue carbon, so offshore and ocean carbon storage, because it's a really important component too. So there are other people working on that. Blue carbon is a huge topic that people are doing research on. It just didn't overlay with the analysis that we had already done. And oceans, yes, they are a different system. Oceans absorb a huge amount of our heat, and they're getting to the point where they are warming very fast, and they're also getting more acidic, and it is problematic. And so our oceans are doing a great benefit, but they're also struggling because of it. So I hope to say in the future that we will be able to have similar information for the oceans, but it takes time, and hopefully we'll get there.
Anyone else? I have a question. Now, you said you're a climate scientist, not a forester,
Yes.
but during your work on the reports, you had to do some work with plants. Is there a way to calculate the amount of carbon that a plant would store? So I'm thinking, for example, in terms of backyard plants. Is there a way where if you plant some native shrubs, you can estimate how much carbon they're going to store as opposed to if you did nothing?
Yeah, there are people that dig into that. So the way that we got our carbon data was actually from satellite remote sensing data, and then multiple other components. So I worked very closely with a carbon scientist from USGS for this report. So it's looking at broad scale carbon storage in the living plants, in the dead matter, and also in the soil. But you can also assess the ability of each plant to store carbon, and there are people that do that. And there was a presentation that I saw with Connecticut Audubon, that there was a gentleman that was studying the carbon storage of different tree species and the growth. So you can measure like the growth of the tree, the diameter of the tree, and like different ways of metrics of how it grows to understand how much carbon it's storing. And he had done a whole study somewhere in Connecticut. I can find out who the presentation was and link it to you, but there is a way, and people are doing it to see like the carbon storage capacity of individual plants and individual forest stands as well. And I've done carbon storage in soils before, and our soils store a lot of carbon. You can take those and analyze them in a lab to see how much carbon a system is storing. And that's dependent on geology and soil type and all sorts of different things.
Anybody else have a-
relates to oceans?
Yep.
The top 2 feet of the oceans contain a lot of phytoplankton. How do they factor into this carbon storage and carbon dioxide emissions?
Yeah, they're a huge component. So the phytoplankton, as well as the ocean sediments, have very high carbon capacity, storage capacity, and sequestration. And that again is that it's called blue carbon. That's sort of the catchphrase for it. And I know that there can be problems with the warmer water at the top, them moving further down. It's a similar thing that I talked about with the seabirds sort of starving because they weren't able to access their resources. Like changes in where these organisms are in the water level can have cascading effects too. So certainly it's something I'd like to dig into more and explore the blue carbon component, because it is a huge part of this whole equation.
That does it for me, Dennis.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, if not, thank you, Brooke. Thank you very much. And remember,
Thank you
people,
for having me.
that next week we have Pat Lynch with some tips on making your backyard more wildlife friendly. Brooke, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
It was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.